start the recording.
Okay.
So yeah, I got it figured out. We just have to do it from the laptop.
You know, I was playing around with my mobile app also, and I realized that on the mobile app you can't do it unless you have a paid subscription.
Yeah.
And on the laptop you have to have the newer version. I could not figure it out for the world.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. I started recording. Let's do this for the second time.
Round two.
Okay. So this is for race in the United States. My name is Stephanie Camayo, and my myth is that sickle cell anemia is a racial disease.
And I am Richard Maricut, and the myth that I'm reviewing is the myth that racism does not exist. So I can start it off again, Stephanie.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, and the myth that racism doesn't exist. You know, first of all, from the studies that I've been showing and reviewing, one of the things that I can just tell from living in 2019 is that our society has become divided on also many different topics outside of race. So, you know, depending on, you know, who you speak with, there's always a division about politics. There's a difference in sports teams. There's a difference about religion, and we've gotten to this point now where everything has to be divided. And so we're tying that back to race or racism. You know, again, that's one of the just because you don't believe it exists doesn't mean it's not occurring. One of the websites that I happened to look at called benjerry.com showed an example of a recent study that said blacks made up 13%, only 13% of the general population, and 40% of those in prison. Again, sometimes you end up seeing in media that it always portrays prison primarily black or Hispanics or other races outside of white. You know, and then also another study done by NBC showed that 64% of those surveyed do believe that racism is a problem, but 30% said it exists today, but not a problem. 3% said it once existed, but no longer exists, and 1% said that it never was a problem at all. And so, again, I think it's difficult to sometimes have that conversation because the way our society is you have to be open to both sides of it, and we've gotten to a point now where we're just divided. So again, in order to talk about racism, I think you first have to be open-minded and educate yourself on the other race's perspective. And sometimes that's difficult to do, right? Because unless you've lived through the skin color of the other, you can try to understand, but you'll never truly feel what the race is from any other race color outside of your own. So let me pause there and ask you, Stephanie, if you have any thoughts on what I just covered there regarding, you know, this racism exists.
I pretty much agree with everything you said. I think that just because schools aren't segregated anymore, and just because we can have a black president, doesn't mean that racism does not exist anymore. Whenever I was in high school, you know, it was 90s still. The school, you would look around and you would see the whites sitting with whites, the blacks sitting with blacks, Hispanics sitting with Hispanics. And even though it wasn't segregated that way, it's like they all kind of went their separate way. Very rarely would you see in that era, you know, a minority sitting with the Caucasians. So I agree 100% that racism does still exist. I've been in racism before. I've had comments thrown my way because they think I'm completely white, or they don't know if I'm Mexican, or I've had black women ask me if I'm, you know, albino. And I mean, they tell me that I don't belong in their world sometimes. You know, I've heard that from like the older black people. Also, my ex-husband, he was black. So being in a in a racial relationship, you also get looked at really, really badly. And I think it's because how we're raised, right? So I was raised not to look at color. I'm biracial. So, but you still have those older people who were raised that color does exist and you do need to look at color, and interracial relationships aren't supposed to be. And so I think that unless somebody breaks that will, that round circle, that race is bad, it's going to be hard to talk about unless you're raised that way.
That's true, and that's a perfect example. I have a very similar situation. So my wife is black. My first daughter is mixed. I'm Italian and Filipino. So my daughter is mixed of Italian, Filipino, and black, and my stepdaughter is black. And so when the three of us go out, I often get like I was in a shoe store trying to buy my stepdaughter some shoes, and I happened to just be walking alongside her, and the sales lady asked her, "Do you need help?" She said no, and then she asked me, "Do you need help?" And subconsciously, I'm thinking, "Why would you ask me? I'm with her," But then I have to remind
Right.
myself, again, if it's not the norm, and I'm not saying that that situation was necessarily racism, but it just goes to show that just because of the skin complexion being different, it automatically means that you're not together,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And one of the statements that I saw from the website titled "Race: The Power of Illusion," the psychologist Beverly Tandon, she kind of phrased it in a very perfect way, and her statement said, "Part of the problem lies in the lack of interaction between whites and other races." She points out that for many white people who live in predominantly white communities, there are no racial issues because there are no other races. Furthermore, all the information about minorities may be coming from secondhand sources such as television, movies, and ethnic jokes, right? And
Mm-hmm.
one of the about social media now and Facebook, Instagram, everyone having access to quick visuals without a lot of context behind it. It's easy to see two races fighting, and you come up with your own assumption of who the bad person was. Or
Right.
sometimes the media may portray individuals with non-white skin as automatically being bad, right? And then you see a similar um, um, action done by a white person, and it's almost rolled up as a troubled youth, right, or someone
Right.
that needs mental illness. But if it's another complexion, it's almost terrorism, right? And
Mm-hmm.
or the bad history of this person doing a lot of negative things, right? And so I think subconsciously all of that is being fed to people, and especially our youth, and they just end up growing with that mentality, and by default just picking up on skin color being um, something that portrays good versus bad, right? And so,
Right.
but I that that example of us being biracial, again, it's not something that a person who's white could understand as much as I tried to explain it. Until you're in that situation where you feel that you're being judged by your complexion or the people that you're with, you truly can't know that the feeling exists. And that's why I think sometimes people
Right.
think that racism doesn't exist, because you can't feel what it means to be in someone else's skin complexion.
Yeah,
Right.
I completely agree. That was a good
So
statement that lady said.
yeah, no, it's. I mean, I agree with that 100%. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to recount that, because, oftentimes you see on TV where individuals just really dispute the fact that racism exists, but they come from a different, completely, type of environment. So for them, they truly may feel that racism doesn't exist, and in their mind, they're not wrong, but it's only because of the perspective and the viewpoint that they have and their environment that they're in. And that's why I think it makes it difficult to talk about it, because that's just like trying to tell somebody that, you know, uh, Santa Claus is real. And it's like, no, just because you never seen him doesn't mean he's not necessarily real. And I know that's pretty extreme, but it's one of those things, unless you're in it, that you can't relate.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I'm glad we see eye to eye on that one. It seems like our similar experiences are
Yes,
in line
yes.
to support. So I'll turn it
Yep.
over to you.
Okay, awesome. So my myth was about sickle cell anemia. So it said sickle cell anemia. So in the US, it's seen as a racial disease that can be passed down from person to person, and that it's only found in African American descent. So the actual first case was recorded in the US for a dental student in Chicago. The dental student did have the appearance of an African American, but he is actually Caribbean, and him and his parents were from a Caribbean island in North America. This disease is mostly widespread in malaria-stricken areas or those with ancestors that were in malaria-stricken areas, such as like West Africa, the Mediterranean, India, and the Middle East, and also Asia, places in Asia as well. Sickle cell anemia has to be passed with both parents. So both parents have to be the carrier. So it's actually a genetic disease. If only one parent has the gene, the other parent does not, the child will be healthy, but they will be a carrier of it. The carrier is susceptible, I can't say that word, susceptible to catch malaria, but the symptoms won't be as severe as if they had sickle cell anemia. With malaria epidemics in the US cases, they are lower than other countries. So that's why the cases of sickle cell anemia are lower here in the US than they are in the other countries. If we were to go there and do a test, there would be a ton of cases of sickle cell anemia versus the cases that were found here. So it is not race-based. You cannot catch it from someone. The disease is passed from gene only, and you can only have it if both of your parents are carriers. And only if your parents are from a malaria-stricken country or your ancestors were.
Yeah. And so one of the things that you had mentioned last time we talked was about how, especially in America, with our society being mixed with so many nationalities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's a perception, or like you said, a myth that it's predominantly in African Americans, and part of that perception is because, to your point, where it started from in the Caribbean areas, a lot of us may not know our ancestors where they really came from years and years ago.
Right.
And without knowing that, it's easy to put the kind of the bubble over only a particular race and not
Mm-hmm.
really in the world where it originated from, right?
Right. Well, if we look at race, the actual meaning of race is a race of people. So, like, you can have a Black Italian, you can have a really dark skin, they appear Black. Look at Colombians and Cubans. They have dark skin. Their hair is the same as ebony skinned people, right? So, they have like the coarse hair in Colombia. So, the Colombians look like they're Black, but they're not. They're Colombians. The same with Dominican Republic. They look Black, but they look African American, but they're not. They're Dominican Republic, and that's where they come from. So these Caribbean islands, yeah, they have dark-skinned people, but they're not African Americans. They're not from African descent. They're from these Caribbean islands, or their ancestors were, and that's where it's coming from. And I think that people skew the meaning of race. And really, they're talking about the ethnicity of someone's skin color.
Yeah. One thing, and I wasn't able to find anything online about this, but and it could be just based off of what's shared out in the public. But when you typically hear about celebrities that have sickle cell, um, they tend to be African American or Black skin color, right? And I think I shared with you before that one of my best friends, who's also Black, has sickle cell, and that was the first time that I've ever even heard of sickle cell when him and I initially became friends. And so until I heard about that, and he was the only person that I knew, it kind of fed to what you're saying is the myth that
Yeah.
it's predominantly Americans. Why do you think that is, that it doesn't seem to be heard from, especially from celebrities other than African Americans?
So I think that if they did a genealogy test, one of their ancestors is going to be from one of those countries. If you look, there is hardly any of the population that isn't mixed. There is so much interracial mixing that even the truest, whitest person could not, they may not be Caucasian. Like I said last time, my aunt has green eyes, blonde hair, light skin, can't tan, but she lives in Madrid, Spain, and speaks fluent Spanish. So I think people's perception of skin color is skewed. And I think that because a lot of the population is mixed with what we call an African American, but the black skin color, that's probably why. If you looked at their genealogy and saw their back in their genealogy, their DNA is going to show that it's probably going to show like Caribbean or Mediterranean or maybe even West African, because the malaria is in West Africa. So that's what I feel. I don't know for sure, but that's my feelings on it, is that intermingling, how do you say that? Intermingling, I can't talk, races is going to, you take a white girl and a black boy and they make a baby, right? And that black boy, he may have been Caribbean, right? Or Dominican Republic. He looks black though. And that baby is Dominican Republican white, but he looks mixed with black and white, right? And the dad has sickle cell anemia. Well, let's say the mixed baby gets with a fully black woman who is from African America, West Africa, and she has sickle cell anemia, or she's a carrier. They have a child who looks African American, is really Dominican Republican, West African, and the child will have sickle cell anemia. So I think it's that interracial coming together and just mixing it all together, but I think that's why the majority, and plus if you look at a lot of the Caribbean islands, they do have a lot of dark-skinned people that look like they are black people.
Right. Well, I mean, based on the geographic area where it's located, closer to the equator,
yeah.
Part of half of my nationality again is Filipino, and in the Philippines, depending on the part of the Philippines that you're at, you can be lighter skinned or you can be very, very dark.
Yeah, I have a Filipino friend. One of my very best friends is Filipino, and she is very dark. She gets mistaken for an African American all the time, and she's not.
Yeah. Well, that kind of ties into both of our myths, right? I mean, from race perspective and racism, also down to the scary, right, that are passed down. It has really no bearing on the skin color, although by default, and part of the myth is that we sometimes tend to use skin color to categorize diseases, social status, even sport, politics, everything else that I mentioned based on skin color. And I guess going back to both of our topics, I think it deserves a lot more conversation than we probably do today. But I think we have to always just keep the open mind and be able to have that conversation, not get offended, but being able to talk through things to educate ourselves. But Stephanie, this has been great. I appreciate the feedback and the history on sickle cell, because again, I was a little blinded by that as well. So thank you for the talk and the history on that.
Yeah, thank you for your input on racism. It brought some light. And like I said, I love what that woman said. She brought it all into perspective.
That's it.
All right, thank you. I will end this recording and send it over to you so you can submit it, and then we'll submit our reflections.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a blessed night. Bye.